Hello YouTube viewers, welcome to another episode of Malcontent Corner where I, your host John, am going to take you through little tips, tricks, and secrets of things that I've learned in the course of my day-to-day life. Today we're going to talk about a solenoid cover with a built-in start switch and why you may want to consider putting one on your Evolution-powered big twin Harley Davidson motorcycle. So stay tuned for a little history lesson and the hows and whys you may want to put one in. Coming up next. Time for a little history lesson here at Malcontent Corner, and I promise you there's a reason why we're going through this. Now, back in the days of yore, even before my time, and we're talking about 1953 and earlier, a lot of cars had a start pedal on the floorboard. And what that start pedal did is when you push down on it, through mechanical linkage, the starter gear would actually be moved forward so that the teeth of it would engage with the teeth on the flywheel of the vehicle. At the end of its travel, that linkage would then make contact with a button switch, which was normally open, and it would close that switch. And what that would do is that would allow the power, the 6 volts from the battery, because they used 6-volt systems back in the day, to go from the battery and connect it to the starter, starting the cranking process. Well, about the mid-50s, they changed that, and they changed that from a manual mechanical means to an electromechanical means, with the addition of the solenoid. Now, what lives in the solenoid is copper windings in a circular format. And also what lives in there is this lovely little solenoid plunger that looks like this. Now, what happens is, whether it be your motorcycle or your car, when you hit the start button on your motorcycle or you put the key in the ignition of your car and you crank it all the way to the start position, 12 volts is supplied to that solenoid, and the current flow through there makes a magnetic field, which then moves this solenoid plunger forward into the housing. And the stub shaft on here actually engages, but pushes the starter gear forward so that engages with the teeth of the flywheel. And at the very back end is a copper washer here that, when this is in its fully engaged position, will make contact with 2 contact points inside the solenoid, completing the circuit and allowing 12 volts to flow from the battery to the starter, starting the cranking process. Now, at the back end of your starter is the solenoid is a housing that probably looks very similar to this. If it's stock, it looks very similar to this, and it's just a one-piece tin housing. And what you're doing here is you are going to replace this, and you'll have to forgive me because I don't have a physical example here. The only one I have is on my motorcycle, which is put away for the winter. But you are going to be replacing that with a solenoid cover that looks like this. Now, this has 2 things going for it. Number one, it's chrome, so the bike goes faster. Okay, all kidding aside, the main thing is this giant push button right here. And that push button happens to conveniently line up with the very center button on this solenoid plunger here. And that gives you a manual way to engage this solenoid plunger. Now, as I said, you have the electromechanical way, which is designed into the motorcycle, and that will still work. But now you have a manual way. So if you're dealing with some sort of a starting issue where this plunger is not engaging fully, such as the Harley Click of Dread, you now have a way to sidestep that by manually engaging this plunger. Now, the nice thing is I call that a fail-safe button, because as long as you have a good starter, good contacts in your solenoid, and a good battery, odds are very likely, if you can engage this plunger, you are going to be able to make the bike crank. And there's 2 reasons why you may want to consider putting one on your motorcycle. Number one is if you're dealing with the Harley Click of Dread, and if it is an intermittent problem. I did a video series on it, and it can be one item, it could be a bunch of items. So obviously you can go through a handful of them and think you have the problem licked, and it may rear its ugly head at the most inopportune times. Well, never fear, because you can always manually engage the solenoid plunger and get the bike started. The other reason may or may not work for you. It worked for me. I thought I'd pass it on. One day I took the bike out of the garage and I was playing around with it, and then I went in the house to work on a project. I didn't realize I had left the bike I left the ignition on, basically. And I come out 5 hours later because I wanted to go for a nice evening ride, and I found My lights were burning, my tail light was burning, my run lights were burning, everything was burning, and as to be expected, there was not enough juice in the battery to start the bike. I got off and thought, man, you know what, I'm gonna just try this. So I hit the button on the solenoid cover, and there was enough juice in the battery to start the engine up through a compression stroke, but not enough to overcome it. So I let off the button and hit it one more time, and there was enough juice and enough momentum there to carry the bike through the compression stroke, and what do you know, it fired up. Now it saved me a bit of time because I didn't have to throw the bike on the charger for however long it took, and I could actually go for the ride and at the same time recharge the battery. Now, will that always work for you? It may not. It worked for me. And you know what? It saved me some time. So out on the road, that could be a big deal because invariably when something like that's going to happen, it's going to happen on a Sunday when it's almost impossible to get the bike home. So that's the reason why you may want to consider putting one on your motorcycle. Safety first here, and I'm going to ask you that number one, you please disconnect the positive lead on your battery. Doing such will prevent you from shorting anything out or anything untoward happening which may injure you or your bike. And also, if you are not fortunate enough to wear stylish glasses such as these, please wear safety goggles when working on it. Odds are nothing's going to get in your eye, but you never know, and you only have two eyes, and losing one is a big deal. So please, safety first, disconnect the battery, wear eye protection. Once you've disconnected the positive lead of your battery, you're going to pull the 3 screws out of this cover here and replace them with the new cover that has the push button on it. Now, on your Harley, you're going to find, in my example here, this is an automotive starter. They're actually Phillips head screws. On the Harleys, I believe they, at least on mine, they used hex-headed screws. I believe they were 9/32. In my case, it was a real easy thing to do. You know, it was easy to pull it off, but a little more fussy to put it on. The reason for that is because there is a spring on this stub shaft here, and when you pull that cover out, this plunger is actually going to push out a little farther than it normally should. And in my case, it was a little fussy trying to get this compressed in, make sure the gasket didn't slip on it, and to get this at least 2 out of the 3 screws going with some good thread insertion in the housing. You want to make sure you do not strip the threads of the housing. You do need the end cover on your solenoid, and you do not want the plunger, you know, if you only put it in 1 or 2 threads, there's a likelihood that that plunger, the pressure of it, may rip those screws out and strip those threads. So make sure you get at least 3 or 4 or more turns of that on those screws to make sure that housing is at least somewhat well in place. And for me, it took about 15 minutes to get the new cover on. And that also included a few minute break right smack dab in the middle because I was getting frustrated and I needed to stop and realign my chi. But it's a real easy thing to do. Now, I'm going to dispel a few myths here. Number one is the myth that somebody can come up and just hit that start button and ride off with your motorcycle. That it will be true if you do not have your ignition locked and if they just come up and turn it to the run position and hit that start button and ride off. But if that's the case, they can just throw their leg over it, hit the start button on the handlebar, and ride off. And that leads to the second myth, that putting this solenoid cover with the push button on there disables the electromechanical way of starting your motorcycle. It does not. If your bike currently has a start switch on the handlebars, it will still have a start switch that works on the handlebars even once you replace that cover. Again, I just kind of consider it to be a fail-safe way. It's a second way of being able to engage that and that starter. And as long as you have a good starter, and as long as you have a good battery, and as long as you have good contacts within that solenoid, you should be able to get that engine to crank. Now, that being said, this cover is not a panacea for manual or failures of the starter or of the battery. If you have a weak battery, and I guarantee you if it's 4.5 or 4.5 years old and older, it's probably getting towards the tail end of its life. You might be able to get out of a jam or two and get home, but don't push your luck. If your battery's over 4 years old and you're having cranking problems, replace that battery. If you have a starter problem where you have a brushes that are going bad in there, or a winding that's going bad in there through heat soak, that this way is not going to mitigate that. It's still going to be an issue. And lastly, if you have contacts within your solenoid housing that are getting worn out and going bad, this plunger is only going to have so much travel to it. So, you know, if your contacts here are pretty much shot, they're going to still be pretty much shot. Again, this solenoid cover with the push button is a way to engage the solenoid plunger if this electromechanical means does not seem to be cutting it. Now, I am going to give you a couple of warnings in putting one of these on your bike. Now, let's say you've got it on there, but one of the things you want to be aware of is where is your exhaust pipe in relation to the button. And the reason why I say that is, you know, everybody's exhaust is a little different. And if you have an exhaust pipe that's running right over it, you're going to be hard pressed to get to that button, and there's really no sense in changing the solenoid housing cover at all. If your exhaust is somewhat in the way and it's not easy to get to, but you can get to it, you may want to consider carrying a socket extension with you, or even better, a hard wooden dowel, so that you can at least reach in there and hit the button on the off chance you should need to. My point being here is you do not want to burn your fingers. Now, the last warning I'm going to give you about this, and I really cannot emphasize this enough, if you go to hit this start button, let's say you're out on a Taco Thursday night and you've been out drinking and you go to hit, hey guys, check this out. For the love of God, make sure your bike is in neutral. I don't know about you, I've at least once or twice in my life of riding, got on the bike, had it in gear, and didn't have enough sense to pull in the clutch and hit the starter, and what happens? The bike jerked and lurched on me. Now, that's fine because I'm on the bike. But if you hit this start button, it is on the solenoid cover, it is going to crank. And typically you will not be on that bike. And if it lurches and jerks on you and that's all that happens, consider yourself lucky. Obviously, it can go up in degrees of severity from there. It could lurch and the jiffy stand could fold under it and it could fall over and damage your bike. It could fall over and hurt somebody. You know, who knows? Maybe if it's in the run position, it might actually start up and kind of motor off a little bit and crash into something. So again, please, please, please make sure your bike is in neutral. It's the safest thing you can do, and it's a good way to make sure that your ride ends up being a great, fun, and successful ride. Now, with that being said, we're done here on this episode of Malcontent Corner. I hope you found this to be somewhat useful. Again, they are a solenoid cover with the push button. I highly recommend them. How much you pay for it, that's entirely up to you. But if you can get one on your motorcycle, I would strongly recommend you put one on your motorcycle, because you never know the day when you may need it, and it's better to need it and have it than to need it and not have it. So with that being said, thank you for tuning in. I appreciate you watching this video. Please click like if you liked it. Feel free to leave comments. And with that, I'm going to take leave of you. Have a good time, and I will be back soon with some more information and tidbits to hopefully make your life a little bit easier. Until then, take care.